Welcome in, everyone. This deep dive, it's going to be a tough one. We're looking into the disappearance and death of Kevin Bacon. Yeah, back in December 2019. You've probably seen the headlines, but we're going to go deeper. We're using police reports, interrogation transcripts, even interviews with people close to the case, trying to piece it all together.
Yeah. It's a case that really makes you think about some hard truths.
Mm.
About online interactions, mental health, the limits of understanding people.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the basics. We know that Kevin Bacon, he was a 25-year-old hairdresser from Michigan. He disappeared Christmas Eve 2019. Last anyone heard from him, he was going on a date that he'd set up through a dating app.
Right. And when Kevin didn't show up for Christmas breakfast the next morning with his family, they knew right away something was wrong.
Yeah.
And that his car was found, abandoned. It was at a Family Dollar store. His clothes and phone were still inside.
And that's where it gets tricky, right?
Absolutely. So the police, they had actually already had some dealings with the guy Kevin was talking to online, this Mark Latunski. Just a month before, another man had gotten away from Latunski's house. He was terrified, wearing nothing but a leather kilt. And he told the police that Latunski had chained him up in the basement.
Wow. So similar to what happened with Kevin, knowing what we know now about Latunski, do you think those early warning signs, could they have been interpreted differently? Could something more have been done?
That's a tough one. Hindsight, right?
Yeah.
At the time, the police were looking at a missing person case. And yeah, the incident with the kilt guy was definitely concerning, but it wasn't really enough for them to, search Latunski's property without some more solid evidence.
Right. So the police went to Latunski's house to ask him about Kevin. What happened then?
What they found, it was truly horrifying. They found Kevin's body down in the Latunski's basement, hanging by his feet. The scene was awful. There were signs that he had been partially mutilated.
God. The interrogation transcript that we have, it's bizarre. Latunski, he's all over the place.
Yeah, his statements are like, they're rambling and contradictory. He goes on about his identity, saying his real name was stolen, And then he starts bringing up these crazy conspiracy theories, talking about poisoned wells, saying he's some kind of a Norwegian god. It's like this mix of delusions and these grandiose claims.
Yeah. And at one point he even said that, like, the actor Kevin Bacon was his hero. It's just hard to understand what was going on in his head.
Well, it's clear that mental health was a big factor in this case. When you look at the interviews with Latunski's ex-wife and husband, they talk about his long history of mental health problems, paranoia, delusions. He had even been diagnosed with schizophrenia at some point, which, is serious. It means distortions of reality, hallucinations, disorganized thinking.
Yeah. And that brings us to this really disturbing part of the case. Latunski claimed that Kevin's death, it was an assisted suicide. He said that Kevin wanted to die and that he even wanted to be, partially consumed.
Yeah, but it's hard to see how that fits with the evidence.
Yeah.
There's nothing in Kevin's messages or anything online that shows he was suicidal or that he'd agreed to anything like that.
But mental illness, does that absolve someone of responsibility for such a brutal act? Could Latunski have actually believed what he was saying?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Mental illness, it can definitely cloud judgment. It can distort how someone sees reality. But it's important to remember that people with mental illness, they can still understand right from wrong. The severity of what Latunski did, the planning involved, the way he tried to cover it up, it suggests, to me at least, a certain level of awareness and culpability.
And then you have that text message, that chilling text that Latunski sent to his husband on Christmas Day. He said, "I had bacon for dinner last night." Ugh, it gives me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah, it's hard to hear that message and not think about, what we know now. It makes you wonder about Latunski's state of mind.
Yeah.
What was he thinking? Was it like a boast? Some kind of morbid joke? Or is it a sign of a truly disturbed mind?
Latunski even talked about, making jerky and bone meal out of Kevin's remains. It's just, I can't even fathom that level of depravity.
Yeah, cannibalism. It's extremely rare, and it's taboo, right? Often it's connected to severe mental illness, like a complete disconnect from reality. It's really important to approach this part of the case carefully and avoid sensationalizing it. But at the same time, we have to recognize how serious Latunski's actions were.
So are there any psychological explanations for this kind of behavior? Have there been other cases like this?
Well, it's important to remember that every case is different. We can't diagnose Latunski from here. But in some cases, cannibalism can be linked to what we call extreme psychosis, That's where someone loses touch with reality completely, and they start acting on these distorted beliefs or impulses. There have definitely been cases where cannibalism is connected to things like schizophrenia or really severe personality disorders.
It's a disturbing thought to think about someone losing their grip on reality like that. But what about the law? How does someone's mental state, how does that factor into a crime like this?
So, the legal system, it does recognize that mental illness is complex. If someone is found to be legally insane, it means they couldn't understand what they were doing or the consequences of their actions when the crime happened. They might be found not guilty by reason of insanity, but that's a really high bar to clear.
So even if someone has schizophrenia, they can still be held accountable for their actions.
Absolutely. Just because someone has a mental illness diagnosis doesn't mean they're legally insane. The court has to figure out if their mental state at the time of the crime actually stopped them from understanding that what they were doing was wrong.
So in Latunski's case, were his actions solely because of his mental illness?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we're going to keep digging into as we go through more of the evidence. We need to consider everything. His history, what he said, the physical evidence is all part of understanding this complex case.
It's clear that we've only just scratched the surface here. We'll continue looking into the Kevin Bacon case after a short break. We're going to go deeper into the complexities of Latunski's mental state and try to make sense of what motivated him. We'll also be looking at the bigger implications of this case, things like online safety and the ethical questions around assisted suicide. Stick with us. So we've been talking about the really disturbing details of Kevin Bacon's death and Mark Latunski's claims that it was assisted suicide. But like we said, there's a lot of evidence that doesn't fit with that.
Yeah, it's like Latunski was trying to make it seem like what he did was some act of kindness, like some twisted mercy. But when you look at how brutal it was, the planning, his plans for Kevin's remains, it points to something much darker than just helping someone end their life.
Right. And we can't forget that Latunski actually ate part of Kevin's body. He even talked about dehydrating some of the flesh to make jerky. It just, how do you even process that?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most disturbing parts of this whole thing. Cannibalism, it's a huge taboo, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's linked to really serious mental illness, like completely losing touch with reality.
And in the interrogation transcript, he talks about it so casually, even compares it to eating Rocky Mountain oysters. It's chilling.
What's really interesting here is that it seems like Latunski's trying to make it sound normal. Like he's trying to downplay the horror of what he did. He describes how he prepared and cooked the flesh, almost like he's giving a recipe.
It's like he's trying to convince himself and the detectives that it was totally rational, acceptable even.
Exactly. And then you have these elaborate plans he had for the rest of Kevin's remains. Burying the intestines with peach pits, crushing the bones for bone meal to use on his tulips.
It's almost ritualistic.
Like he was creating some kind of horrible garden,
Yeah. Yeah.
a monument to what he did. God, it's creepy.
Yeah, and it brings up this really important question. How much of what Latunski did can we blame on his mental illness? Was
Wow.
he really not able to understand that what he was doing was wrong? I don't know. It's tough. It's obvious he had serious mental health problems. The paranoia, delusions, maybe even schizophrenia. But does that excuse what he did? Does it mean he's not responsible?
It's really complicated. Mental illness can definitely affect someone's judgment, make them see things differently. But people with mental illnesses are often still capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong.
So how do we reconcile that? Like, how do we make sense of the fact that he had schizophrenia, but he also did these awful things?
Well, you have to look at how much planning went into it. The brutality of the crime. The fact that he tried to cover it up, all that suggests he knew what he was doing and then he knew it was wrong. So it's not so simple as saying his mental illness caused everything.
It feels like we're in this moral and ethical gray area. We have this guy who is obviously struggling, but we also have this horrible crime and a victim who deserves justice. How do we balance compassion for people with mental illness and the need to hold people accountable?
You're right. That's one of the biggest challenges in our justice system. Finding the balance isn't easy. We have to acknowledge that mental illness can lead to people doing extreme and unpredictable things, sometimes with really tragic results.
Yeah. It makes you realize how much we still don't know about the human mind
Hmm.
and what makes people violent. It's easy to just label someone like Latunski as evil, but I think this case is a lot more complicated than that. We have to think about mental illness, personal responsibility, and all the things that contribute to this kind of behavior.
Exactly. We can't just write off what Latunski did as the actions of some evil person. We need to look deeper. Try to understand the psychological factors that might have been at play. It's not about making excuses, but about trying to get a better understanding of how the human mind works.
This case also makes you think about the role of online platforms in all of this. How they can facilitate these kinds of encounters. What can we do to make sure people are behaving responsibly online? And how do we protect people who might be vulnerable?
That's a great point. Kevin Bacon's story is a really tragic example of the dangers that are out there online. We need to be really aware of the risks and put online safety first. That means being careful about what personal information you share, trusting your gut, and reporting anything suspicious to the right people.
We also need to learn how to spot the warning signs of predatory behavior and teach ourselves and others how to stay safe online. It's about creating a culture where everyone understands online safety and takes responsibility for it. A culture where people can make good choices and get help if they need it.
This case, as tough as it is, it gives us a chance to learn and grow. It forces us to really look at how complicated mental illness is, to fight for better access to mental health care, and to promote responsible behavior online.
Yeah, we've really gone deep into some dark territory with this deep dive. We've looked at the horrific details of Kevin Bacon's murder. We've tried to understand Mark Latunski and what motivated him. And we've talked about some really hard truths about mental illness and violence. It's a case that leaves us with a lot of questions, but it shows us that it's important to keep talking about these things and trying to understand them.
It's a sobering reminder that even when something truly awful happens, there are still lessons to be learned and things we can take away from it. It's by having these tough conversations that we can try to make the world a safer and kinder place.
Thank you for being here with us on this difficult journey. We'll be back with another deep dive soon. We'll be exploring something new and challenging your perspectives. Until then, keep thinking about what we've talked about today, and keep having those important conversations about mental health, online safety, and what it means to be human. So we're back, and we've been going through this disturbing case. And it's hard to put together the Mark Latunski, who was, like a father, a husband, with the oddball things he did. How do we even begin to understand that?
Yeah, it's a real clash. You see these flashes of something normal, Family Guy. It seems successful. And then you have these horrific acts. It's tough to reconcile.
It just shows you, how darkness can hide even in places that seem totally normal. How could he separate these parts of his life like that?
It's chilling, really.
Mm-hmm.
The way he was able to compartmentalize.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas with his husband, going to the gym, all while carrying this huge, horrible secret.
Like he was living two completely different lives.
Yeah.
And the fact that he never told anyone except for that one weird text to his husband. It's just, I don't get it.
It really points to a deep level of denial. Maybe he couldn't or wouldn't face what he'd done. Maybe that compartmentalizing, it was a way to protect himself, to hold on to this idea of himself as normal and not deal with the consequences.
So what can we take away from this? What does it tell us about people? About how we're capable of both good and evil?
I think it forces us to face some hard truths about how complicated we are as humans. We have to accept that mental illness, it can show up in really extreme and unexpected ways, and it really underlines how important it is to help people early on and make sure they can get mental health services.
It reminds us how much we still don't understand about the mind. It's easy to label someone like Latunski as just evil, but this case is way more than that. It makes us think about mental illness, about personal responsibility, and all the things that lead to violence.
I agree. We can't just dismiss what he did as some evil act. We need to look closer, try to figure out what was happening psychologically, not to excuse him, but to get a better grasp of the human psyche, how complex it really is.
And this case also brings up online platforms, how they can make these kinds of encounters possible. What can we do to make online spaces safer? How do we protect people who might be vulnerable?
That's so important. Kevin Bacon's story is a tragic example of the dangers that are out there online. We need to be smart about the risks and make online safety a top priority. Be careful about sharing personal info, trust your gut, and report anything that seems off to the right people.
And we need to know the signs of someone trying to take advantage of others. We have to learn how to protect ourselves and each other online. It's about building a culture of safety and responsibility online, where people can make good decisions and know where to get help.
This case, it's been tough to go through, but it gives us a chance to learn and do better. It makes us think hard about mental illness, about getting people the help they need, and about behaving responsibly online.
We've been to some dark places in this deep dive. We've looked closely at the horrible details of what happened to Kevin Bacon. We've tried to understand Mark Latunski and why he did what he did. And we've talked about some really difficult truths about mental illness and violence. It's a case that raises a lot of questions. but it shows how important it is to keep talking about these things and trying to understand them.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even in the face of something so awful, there are still lessons to be learned. And by having these tough conversations, maybe we can help make the world a little bit safer and a little bit kinder.
Thank you for being here with us on this difficult